Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to my channel. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Atu-kway. I am and I do hope to be your African centered tutor in the very near future. My area of interest is education, specifically speaking, African centered education, and my topic of interest is knowledge of self. Now, knowledge of self is represented behind me in the Baobab framework, and the Baobab framework is a framework for the study of self. It was designed to be used as a tool to help build African organization and break African bondage. And we do this by creating an environment where we can participate in whole systems thinking, where we can self observe. Okay, when we're able to observe our actions, we're able to think and act holistically as a group or as a nation to solve the problems that we need to solve. Okay, so thank you again for taking time out of your precious day to come and watch this video. I hope that these videos do help to make at least a transformative difference in your life, or at least to help give you some more information in this age of information which we are living in. Okay, so without much ado, I just wanted to just have a quick review of the initial video that I did on African self-development. Okay, this is the second video which is part of my African self-development series, and the first video was entitled "What is Self-Development?", where I went into defining what self-development was, and also discussing some I guess some notes from Carter G. Woodson with regards to, or from the book The Miseducation of the Negro. And I did all of that to try and emphasize, or to make, or to drive home the point that African self differs from the Eurocentric self. And in order for you to be able to define the self, you'd need to define it from a trained mind versus just going online and just going and searching for the self-development, and then just basically just going for the general definition that's given for everyone. But of course, one size doesn't fit all. Okay, so today I want to again answer why self-development is important, but also provide more, I guess, more grounding or more foundational information as to what the African self is. Okay, I like to keep my videos about, say, 45 minutes long. And this is work in progress. Okay, this is just a second video, but I hope that I'm able to do this, and I'm able to pack as much information in as possible and make my videos as concise as possible. I also like to give a massive shout out to Father Clemson Brown of Tap Video, or www.tapvideo.com. Father Clemson Brown has documented hours and hours and hours, tens of thousands of hours of some of our master teachers, those of us who are considered African-centered or Pan-Africanists. He has documented tens of thousands of hours of these master teachers, and all of these videos have helped to give us ideological clarity. And this helps, or this is the foundational basis of the work that I do personally as an African-centered tutor. So I'd like to give a massive shout out to Father Clemson Brown. May you rest in peace, may you rest in power. I'd like to give a massive shout out to Transatlantic Productions. If you do get a minute or moment, if you're YouTube, go to Transatlantic Productions. They've got hours and hours of videos online, or just go to www.tapvideo.com to do your some more research. Okay, so let's get into today's video on why self-development is important. Okay, so developing, of course, the African self is profoundly important for for several reasons. Okay, now the major premise of effective education must be self-knowledge. This is something that was said by Dr. Naeem Akbar, who is, of course, one of the master teachers in the African-centered canon. I want to emphasize and I want to drive home the point that as African people, we need specialist information. We don't just need general information. If you are going to if the sources of all your knowledge, or the source of all your knowledge is general information from Google, from ChatGPT, from any of these general sources, it's highly likely this information is going to miseducate you, or you're going to potentially misperceive what this message is talking about. You need information that is personalized to you in order for you to be able to make sense of the reality within which you live. Okay, so when it comes to education, in the first video I was talking about, I have a deep passion for education. For over 10 years now, I have been studying education and studying the self. Okay, um, because it's just a general interest of mine. I'm someone who likes to read. I'm someone who likes to watch, I guess, documentaries and watch videos on YouTube, watch lectures on YouTube. That's what I really spend my time doing. So I spend a lot of time um, just studying on learning about education, reading about education, thinking about education, watching videos on education, attending lectures on education, or just attending forums or contributing to forums on education. So education is something, I'm not an educational professional per se, but I am someone who is very enthusiastic about education. Of course, all of us are engaged in education in some way, shape, or form. In a society where you do need a quote unquote qualification to show that you are someone who can, I guess, uh, you can educate other people. In a way, sometimes it helps. In other ways, we can see the state of education in the world today, and we can see that actually sometimes these qualifications sometimes can hinder people from actually learning. Okay, so anyways, I'm not trying to throw shade on anyone, but I'm saying that to say that sometimes the definitions of things in general in mainstream media is not personalized enough for us as Africans. And this is what the emphasis I was trying to make with my first video, when I was saying that yes, when you come to self-development and you go and you're searching for example, books about self-development, what you find is that most of these books are generalized books. In fact, to speak honestly, these books are designed for the Eurocentric or the European mind, okay, or people who are European or Eurocentric, okay. But if you are someone who is beginning to understand that you as an African has an African self that's different to a European self, that's different to an Indian self, that's different to a Mongolian self, that's different to all the different kinds of selves that are out there, a Chinese self, if you as you begin to realize that, then you begin to understand that you have to personalize information which you ingest. Okay, so today, as I said, Dr. Naeem Akbar made a statement saying that the major premise of effective education must be self-knowledge. So this is something that he said in this book, Know Thyself, and I'm going to be reading from this book today, Know Thyself, written by Dr. Naeem Akbar. So who is Dr. Naeem Akbar? Okay, I'm sure some of you who don't have trained mind, some of you who haven't come across this gentleman, well, Dr. Naeem Akbar is or specializes in personal development, education, and motivation of African people in general, but African American people specifically. He is renowned. He is a renowned psychologist known for his work on African psychology, emphasizing a holistic approach to understanding the self, particularly within the context of African and African American psychology. Okay, he articulates that the African self is composed of multiple dimensions: the physical body, the personal mind, the social relational aspect of the self, and also the tribal ancestral aspect of the self. Each of these dimensions is interconnected, contributing to a comprehensive sense of identity and well-being. I'm going to say that again. Okay, so Dr. Naeem Akbar, this is what Dr. Naeem Akbar looks like. For those of you are not familiar with him, you can go to YouTube. You can certainly go to Transatlantic Productions and search for videos by Dr. Naeem Akbar, lectures by Dr. Naeem Akbar, if you want to educate yourself about who this gentleman is, you can surely go to Google or any of the other search engines, and you will find information about Dr. Naeem Akbar. I do not have his personal, I guess, details or his personal website details, but I'm sure you can find this information out when you search. I'm gonna go and read again what I just read about Dr. Naeem Akbar. So I said that Dr. Naeem Akbar specializes in personal development, education, and motivation of African American people, in specifically, but African people in general. He is a renowned psychologist known for his work on African psychology, emphasizing a holistic approach to understanding the self, particularly within the context of African and African American psychology. Okay, he articulates that the African self is composed of multiple dimensions. Okay, again, this is going back to what I was saying. The African self is not like any of the other selves. The Eurocentric self usually, Dr. Naim Agbo will tell us on this one, but the Eurocentric self usually focuses on the individual self. Okay, the African self is a multi-dimensional um, um, definition, or has a multi-dimensional definition. Okay, so the African self is composed of the physical body, the personal mind, the social relational aspect, and the tribal ancestral aspect. So each of these dimensions is interconnected, contributing to a comprehensive sense of identity and well-being. Okay, so I want to read from um, this book, Know Thyself, by Dr. Naim Akbar, as evidence for, or to back the point that I'm trying to make. Okay, so this book was written, I think, initially, or copyrighted initially in 1998 by, of course, Dr. Naim Akbar. I think the version that I'm reading from is the 2017 version of this book, and pretty much I'm just gonna read from a bit from the blurb of the back, and then I'm gonna go into chapter 2, the definition of self, which is where I want to just read part of that chapter for you to hear. Okay, certainly you should, as I always say, that any book that I put on here should be a part of every African conscious household, and hopefully will be a part of every African household in years to come, or should be part of most households in years to come, so that you should be able to educate yourself on who the African or African peoples are, if you are not sure or if you are interested per se. Okay, so it says in Know Thyself by Dr. Naim Akbar, PhD, how wonderful it is to be taught. And this was a this is from the blurb at the back. It's from the forward by Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, who is another one of our master teachers, Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, who is a Callaway professor, I think is a Fuller E. Callaway professor of education at Georgia State University in Atlanta, or he was, before he passed on. Okay. But it says that how wonderful it is to be taught by a free teacher, a spiritual leader, a member of our family who truly loves the family, an architect of transforming processes, a defender of African people, a beacon, a son of Africa, a divine spirit manifesting our creative genius. Thousands upon thousands of people know Dr. Naim Akbar as a special treasure. This book is another important gift from him to us. It is our responsibility to study these thoughts carefully. To follow these teachings is to guarantee our liberation and to guide us toward our divine destiny. These are words of Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, okay, who is also, as I said, one of our master teachers. May you rest in peace and may you rest in power, okay? So I'm going to go directly to chapter 2, entitled The Definition of the Self. I'm going to read a little bit, I guess it's just over a page or so, and then I'm going to go back into a notes, which is going to discuss why self-development is important. So I want to set the premise of exactly what is the definition of the self, okay, from an African-centered perspective, and then we're going to go into why it's important, okay? So now the book starts out with a this chapter starts out with a statement by Elijah Muhammad, okay, where he says that it is knowledge of self that the so-called Negroes lack, which keeps them from enjoying freedom, justice, and equality. This belongs to them divinely as much as it does to other nations of the earth. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Elijah Muhammad said that it is knowledge of self that the so-called Negroes lack, which keeps them from enjoying freedom, justice, and equality. This belongs to them divinely as much as it does to other nations of the earth. Now, the major premise of effective education must be self-knowledge. In order to achieve the goals of identity and empowerment that we have described above, the educational process must be one that educates the awareness of who we are. Whenever you undertake any form of education, you should be able to answer that question: who are you? Okay. Now, this is not anything that's terribly mystical or complex. It really makes intuitive sense about what education should be. When we look closely at the European American education system, with which we are already quite familiar, we see that the fundamental idea behind this system is exactly this objective of self knowledge. It is not accidental that quote unquote world history centers on the European participation in the world. It is not accidental that a study of quote unquote world religions looks at the world's religions from the perspective of Judeo Christian religions as the norm. It should be no surprise that the history of America begins with the entrance of the Europeans, and the concept of knowledge and civilization has its dawning with the rise of European scholarship, as we're told. European scholars admit that human activity predates the European entrance on the stage of human civilization by tens of thousands of years. This only receives limited mention in the European educational system, as do all the other scientific, artistic, and philosophical discoveries that precede European participation. This exclusive focus on themselves is not due to ignorance, because there is certainly no failure to acknowledge that, for example, Nile Valley, so called Egyptian civilization, was already old when Europeans showed up. They certainly acknowledge that China's civilizations was already ancient when the Europeans found their way there, and certainly America was fully occupied when the European explorers stumbled on the American continent. There's apparently another motive behind this exclusion of the significance of other people's contributions to world civilizations. Though we are not very familiar with the Chinese, the Persian, the Nubian, or traditional Yoruba system of education, they would no doubt focus on their presence on the world stage as the emphasis for their educational system as well. I'm going to read that bit again. There is apparently another motive behind this exclusion of the significance of other people's contributions to world civilizations. When people are educating themselves, if you are about to engage in self-education, you can't afford to go and take someone else's definitions of self or someone else's education system as a basis for your definition of self. You have to find or develop your own educational system which is able to deliver to you, or is going to be able to help you to answer the question of who am I. Okay, which is why we're doing that. Okay, there is apparently another motive behind this exclusion of the significance of other people's contributions to world civilizations. Though we are not very familiar with the Chinese, Persian, Nubian, or traditional Yoruba system of education, they would no doubt focus on their presence on the world stage as the emphasis for their educational system as well. To give the European Americans the benefit of the doubt, we can understand the bias in the educational system as being directed toward the enhancement of their self-knowledge and not necessarily directed towards the deprivation of non-Europeans from obtaining knowledge of themselves. Okay? So for those, there's some people who are always like, when they hear that someone's Pan-Africanist or African-centered, they always want to put you in a hole and say that you're always blaming white people for your problems, always saying that white people are the cause of your problems. No, here is a Pan-Africanist, African-centered, conscious teacher who is telling us that to give European Americans the benefit of the doubt. So we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. We'll say that it's not intentional. We're saying that fine. But at least this is looking at education. We're not gonna blame you. We're just gonna say that you're just doing what you have to do. Okay, Europeans are doing what they have to do. So Africans have to do what they have to do. And what do we have to do? Well, He's saying that to give European Americans the benefit of the doubt, we can understand the bias in the educational system as being directed towards the enhancement of their self knowledge and not necessarily directed towards the deprivation of non-Europeans from obtaining self knowledge of themselves. Okay, for the sake of the argument we are developing here, it would seem that the educational system is very respectful of the fundamental criteria for providing a good education for oneself, and that is it should be directed towards the objective of obtaining self knowledge. Your education, the fundamental criteria for providing a good education for oneself, should be directed towards the objective of obtaining self knowledge. When we discuss developing an educational system for African Americans that will not result in miseducation, as we saw, as Carter G. Woodson wrote extensively about in The Miseducation of the Negro, and I did read from a chapter from the miseducation of the Negro in my first video about what is self-development. So what Naeem Agba is saying here, that when we discuss developing an education system for African Americans that will not result in miseducation, and the reason why our education has resulted in miseducation is because it was developed and designed by other people and not us. Okay, when we discuss developing an educational system for African Americans that will not result in miseducation, we should set as our criteria the process of self-knowledge. We must be very careful that our definition of this process is consistent with our true identity and not working with assumptions of an alien identity. The Euro American concept of self is limited to the experiences of the individual. In fact, their concept of self is more consistent with what Western psychologists would consider ego, or what we would describe below as the dimension of the personal self. Okay, this idea sees the person as restricted to the separate space and time where their body exists. As we shall see below, this is certainly a part of the self, but it is not the totality. It's not the totality of the African it's not the totality of the self from the African perspective. So we're saying that there is something, in fact, in all human areas of activity called the self. Okay. However, the self, the perspective or the perception of the self is different when it comes to different groups of people. If you are African in this world and you're looking to engage in self-development, or you at least want to engage in self-knowledge, you can't just go and just grab anyone's definition of the self. The Eurocentric or the European or Euro-American definition of self focuses on the individual. Okay, it focuses on the ego. Okay, and it's not necessarily the African self. As I said in the beginning, Dr. Naim Akbar articulates that the African self is composed of multiple dimensions, okay, the physical body, the personal mind, the social relational aspect, and the tribal ancestral aspect. And each of these dimensions is interconnected and contributing to a comprehensive or providing a comprehensive sense of identity and well-being, okay? And I'm going to carry on reading, okay? So what is the African self? Now, an African American educational system rooted in self knowledge must begin with African definitions in order to be successful in achieving its goals. The African self is a multi-dimensional occurrence that is represented within the individual but also transcends the individual. It is in the present but also transcends time. If one could chart a two-dimensional concept of the African view of the self, it might look like a figure, and the figure he's got is I'm not sure if I can show the figure, but I will show it. This is the figure that he's got of the African self, and he says that the African self consists of course, the personal mind, of course, the social aspect of the body, of the self, the social relational aspect, the tribal ancestral aspect, and of course the physical body itself. Okay, so that if you know this, then you have to understand that you're not just you if you're going into developing of yourself with Eurocentric definitions of the self, you're only going to be developing your personal mind, but that won't develop your physical body. May even, who knows, it might touch on the physical body because health and wellness is kind of defined within the Eurocentric definition. So fine, let's say you might develop uh, your personal mind, you might develop your physical body, but then you're not really developing your social relational aspect, and you're most certainly not going to be developing your ancestral aspect or tribal ancestral aspect as well. So this is why definition is key, and I wanted to make this point as to why first of all getting the definition correct and why self-development is important. So I'm just going to read on a little bit more. In order for us to obtain knowledge of self, one does not simply gain insight into one's individual ego and its experiences, but instead the self is considered in this holistic way that ultimately I always struggle with this word, encompasses the entire cosmos. Let's look at each dimension or layer of the self from this African perspective and consider what the educational experience must be like. I'm going to stop here because I want to go into why it's important. But the last line in this chapter, not in this chapter, in what I'm reading, in this part of the chapter says that in order for us to obtain knowledge of self, one does not simply gain insight into one's individual ego and its experiences, but instead the self is considered in this holistic way that ultimately encompasses the entire cosmos. The entire cosmos. The African self extends beyond the individual ego. Okay, so there's a lot to the African self, and if you are someone who's interested in developing it, you should certainly be referring to the works such as this one by Dr. Naeem Akbar, Know Thyself, so that you understand what exactly that we're doing. This book has loads and loads of information. It even has information on how to study the self. It talks about deconstructing or decolonizing. There's so much information in this book. There's also so much information in The Miseducation of the Negro. These are all books that should be part of every African conscious household. So I hope I was able to drive home the point why defining the self is very important. It's just as important as actually developing the self. You have to be able to define which self you're developing before you even begin the developmental process. Okay, so let's look at, and I'm going to go through quickly 7 reasons why self development is important, especially from an African-centered perspective or from an African self-developmental perspective. Okay, again, my name is Atu-kway. I am and I do hope to be your African-centered tutor in the very near future. My area of interest is education, specifically speaking African-centered education, and my topic of interest is knowledge of self. Today's video is video number 2 of my African self-development series, which is an introductory into what self is. Okay, so I want to lay a foundational basis for the work that I want to do moving forward. Okay, so let's look at 7 reasons why self-development is important, or developing the African self is important. Okay, so the first reason is the restoration of cultural identity, and that means that this is going to help us to reclaim our heritage. So in the aftermath of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the trans-Saharan slave trade, which lasted which is still in existence, but lasted, has been lasting for over 1,000 years, with the transatlantic slave trade, or colonization, and our relationship with the Europeans has been, I guess, the oppressive relationship has been here for about 600 years. The oppressive relationship with the imperialistic Arabs has been ongoing for over 1,000 years. Okay, but in reclaiming our heritage and restoring our cultural identity, many people of African descent, in the aftermath of colonization and transatlantic slave trade, many people of African descent were forcibly disconnected from our ancestral cultures and histories. So developing the African self is a step or is a step towards reclaiming and reconnecting with this heritage, fostering a sense of pride, identity, and continuity. I'm just going to take a quick sip of, okay, some good stuff, and I'm going to carry on, okay? So the first reason is that um, we need to engage in self-development because it's going to help us to restore our cultural identity. If you're someone who knows that we've undergone colonization, neocolonization, slavery, all those things, it means that we were forcibly disconnected from our ancestral cultures and histories. So developing African step is a step towards the African self, is a step towards reclaiming and reconnecting with this heritage, and which will help us, of course, to foster a sense of pride, identity, and continuity. It's also important that we heal historical trauma, and this is why self development is important. And in order to do this, we need to undergo a process of psychological healing, and that means that we have to acknowledge and address the multi generational trauma caused by slavery, by colonization, and systemic racism. Okay, now this is essential for healing, and by developing a sense of self that includes an understanding of historical and as ancestral experiences, individuals can work through lingering psychological effects of these traumas. I'm going to repeat that again. The second reason why we need to develop our African self is because we need to heal from historical trauma. There's a lot of this work you can find from post-traumatic slave syndrome that was written by Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is also one of what I would consider a master teacher, someone who's dedicated a lot of years in uncovering what has happened to Africans and how the things that we need to know in order to understand ourselves, to know who we are. Okay. So in talking about psychological healing, um, self-development is important because it helps us to acknowledge and address the multi-generational trauma caused by slavery, by colonization, neocolonization, and systemic racism. And we can do this by developing a sense of self that includes an understanding of historical and ancestral experiences. Us as Africans individuals can work through the lingering psychological effects of these traumas. Of course, knowing who you are or knowledge of self is also important for empowerment and self-determination. It can help us to build resilience because by understanding the African self, this strengthens personal and communal resilience, empowering individuals to navigate and resist ongoing societal challenges and inequities. It helps us, of course, with self determination in the sense that it fosters a mindset of self determination. Where individuals see themselves as active agents capable of defining their destinies rather than being defined by external narratives or stereotypes. When you look on TV today, when you look on mainstream media, we know that there's a place and a role that's placed for African people or Black people or Caribbean people to play. We know there's no need in hiding it. It's just confronting the reality. And so therefore, I know that that's not a true reflection of who I am. The society in itself wants to maintain me within or in a particular position. But because I am someone who is involved in self-development, personal self-development, as well as group self-development, I am someone who has an understanding of this, and therefore when I approach self-development, I approach it by making sure that I don't relate or I don't impose those self-definitions or social stereotypes on myself because I know they're not true, simply. Okay. Of course, self-development is important for community and social cohesion. It strengthens community bonds. Of course, the communal aspect of the African self emphasizes the importance of social relationships, collective well-being, encouraging stronger community bonds and mutual support systems. It also helps with our collective identity. So developing the African self reinforces a sense of collective identity, which is vital for communal upliftment and solidarity in the face of social challenges. Um, the fifth reason, of course, is a holistic approach to mental health. Comprehensive well-being, as narrated by Dr. Akbar, advocates for a holistic view of mental health that includes or incorporates spiritual, emotional, and communal dimensions, offering a more comprehensive path to well-being than approaches that focus solely on individual psychology. So, for example, just if I'm building myself and I'm just focusing on what the mainstream definition of the self is, I'm not really building knowledge or building my ancestral aspect of myself. And this is also part of who I am. So I need to know about who my ancestors are or where, and I also need to understand the type of people they are so that I can further understand myself. Okay, so the African self is unlike any other self on the face of the planet. So if you're going to engage in self-development, it means that you healing yourself will also heal your community. Crazy, right? Number six, of course, is intellectual and spiritual growth, and that um, going through developing or self-development enriches your understanding of self. So engaging with the depth and the breadth of African philosophies, wisdom, and knowledge system enriches personal, intellectual, and spiritual growth, offering diverse perspectives and solutions to life's challenges. Okay, so we're not just developing ourselves just to develop it. We have lots of problems to solve as African people, and that's the whole reason you start self-developing, because maybe there's a problem that you want to solve, or there's a whole host of problems that you want to solve. Well, this is going to help us in intellectually and spiritually. Okay, and finally, number seven is that we're going to be able to resist negative stereotypes and counteract some of these negative stereotypes. Okay, so developing a well-rounded African self helps to counteract the negative stereotypes and misconceptions about Africans and people of African descent, promoting a more positive and empowered self-image. So I'm just going to quickly just review what I just said. I'm saying that um, developing it was important for us to develop the African self because one, it helps us to restore our cultural identity. Two, it helps us to heal historical trauma. Three, it helps us with regards to self-empowerment and self-determination. Number four, it helps with community and social cohesion. And number five, it gives us a holistic approach to mental health when we understand self-development and self-knowledge. Number six, it aids with intellectual and spiritual growth. And number seven, it helps us to resist negative stereotypes, which is abundant in, of course, the Western world or Eurocentric information. Okay. So, developing the African self, as outlined by Dr. Naeem Akbar, one of our master teachers, is crucial for healing, it's crucial for empowerment and the restoration of a positive cultural identity for individuals of African descent. Okay, so it also involves embracing and nurturing all aspects of one's identity, historical, cultural, psychological, and spiritual, in order to foster a sense of wholeness and purpose. This approach not only benefits the individual but also strengthens the communities, contributing to a more resilient and vibrant collective identity. Okay, so I hope that this I've given enough reason as to why it's important for us to engage in self development, because this is an individual thing. However, the focus isn't necessarily individual. You have to focus individually on developing the personal aspect of yourself within the personal realm of the holistic self. However, if you do it and I do it and she does it and he does it, what happens is that we begin to develop a pardon me, we begin to develop a more well-rounded version of ourself, the African self, as defined here by Dr. Naeem Akbar. Okay, let's take a quick sip of some ginger goodness. So, I mean, I'm not sure how I just came across. I hope I haven't rushed through the video too much. Um, of course, all of this is linked with what I am doing as an African Center tutor who is dedicated to, of course, restoring African consciousness. And for those of you who are beginning on your journey to self or self-development strategies, and you looking at self-development strategies, I want you to understand that African self is different to any other self. So if you are someone who is of African heritage, it's important that you develop yourself, or you develop the African self, and make sure you're not developing any other self. And what is going to tool that's going to help you is the Baobab framework, which is a framework for the study of self. Okay, as I said, it's important to define the self even before you develop it, because if you don't know what you're developing, you could just be developing any self. Okay, so this is a very important topic. Don't develop yourself before you define it. Many of us, I started off just, I was like, yeah, self-development. I was reading all the books about self-development, blah 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 blah. At some point along the line, I was like, oh, wow, okay, so I've invested in all of this stuff. However, it's still not edifying enough. And luckily, um, from meeting my wife, who introduced me to, of course, my mother-in-law, who had access to a lot of the knowledge and information which I wasn't privy to. Okay, so that's what really set me on this journey, because even though I wanted to self-develop, fate, destiny, whatever it was, or circumstance or coincidence, whatever you want to put it down to, I um, I figured out that there was a, I never come across African centered information, African consciousness before. I just thought that everyone had access, we were all using the same information, but not knowing that there was a whole host of information that was dedicated to us, for us, by people who dedicated years and years of dedicated decades, okay, to revealing to us, first of all, who we are, what the ingredients of the self are, and it will look like if we have a knowledge of self, and how we relate to other people on the face of this planet. Okay, so as I was saying, the Baobab framework is a framework for the study of self. It was designed to be used as a tool to help build African organization and to break African bondage. And we do this by creating an environment where we can participate in whole systems thinking, to self-observe and to take responsibility for our actions. When we are able to observe our actions, we can then begin to think and act as a nation or tribe with a new level of course, clarity. Now, the aim of the Baobab framework for the study of self is not to tell you, who you are, but rather I would like to help you to determine for yourself who you are and what makes you you. Okay, if you're an African person, so who they are and what makes them them. In that sense, we approach knowledge of self by attempting to look at the ingredients that make us who we are. Okay, so this video about why self development is important, I hope I've been able to drive the point home, and I've listed the reasons as to why self development is important. But if you haven't taken anything at all away from this, pardon me, I want you to understand that first of all, it's important to define the self, or define which self you're about to develop first before you even go on developing that self. So once you understand the self, if you're someone who is, for example, you've just started out on your journey of self-development, or you are on your journey of self-development, and you've come at this from developing the individual self. So how to turn my life around, the subconscious mind, think and grow, all of these things, all of this information is what you're going to find is that you're going to be developing your Eurocentric self. Okay, there are three, at least as mentioned by Dr. Naeem Akbar in Know Thyself. There's at least 4 different parts to the African self, and if you are someone who's just developing your personal mind and neglecting your physical body, neglecting your social, regards to your communal self, as well as your ancestral tribal self, you are going to be, well, you're not going to be doing a good job. of self-development. Okay, so you don't want to spend 10 years only to figure out, oh wait, no, I actually need to develop these are the parts of myself. That's why I'm not fulfilled. Okay, and self-development, of course, we know is something, is fundamental and is a foundational aspect of every education. If you are involved in education, at the end of your education, if there is such a thing, you should be able to say, this is who I am. Okay, that's the whole point of an education, or one, at least one of the major functions of an education. So I'm going to wrap up my video. I hope you have taken away from what I have said from this video. I hope this information will help um, to make a transformative difference in your life. If you are someone who is currently on the journey of self-development, congratulations. You know, I hope to work with you in the future, because you know there's so much to learn. Self-development is a lifelong journey. So what I do, or what I'm doing, is just presenting my notes from, let's just say, over 10 years of experience of self-development, and figuring out that actually, you know, it's the self is a very specific thing. It's not a generalized thing at all. Okay. But you know, good luck on this journey. The Barber framework is a framework that it's a work in progress at the moment, in terms of presenting it as a package for individuals who or want to know who they are. Of course, I am available for consultations if you want to understand more and more of the self. But in terms of the Baobab program itself, it's not 100% there yet. So I hope that I will be able to, at least in one of these African self-development videos, I'll be able to confirm when it's ready, and also confirm the website and confirm all of that good stuff. But at the moment, I just want to put out preliminary information about the concept of self, the knowledge of self, so that we can all engage and begin to learn and prepare ourselves for what is coming. Okay, so thank you so much for taking time out of your precious day to listen to my information. My name is Atu-kway. I am the creator and author of the Baba Framework, which is a framework for the study of self. I'm an African centered tutor, and my area of interest is education, specifically speaking, African centered education. And my topic of interest is knowledge of self. Um, Thank you. Okay. And I hope to see you in the next video, where we'll be talking about the potential issues facing Africans who want to engage in self-development. That's going to be video number 3, which is going to look at what we have to do, or at least some of the considerations that we have to make as Africans when it comes to self-development. Okay, so thank you again, and I hope to see you on the next video. Peace.